Hi, everybody. Yes, it is me again, session 5. And this one's about the mentoring agreement, the details, what you actually put in it. The last session was very much about thinking through about how you build or invest in that working relationship. If you do that right, it will kind of see you well, and it will help you resolve any difficulties that you might encounter. So, what are we talking about today? So, we're going to clarify the content of that initial mentoring agreement. I'm going to repeat very briefly some things I said in the last session. Repetition is good, generally helps in learning, but I'm not going to go into it in any great detail. I'll reprise those sections, but I'm really interested today in focusing on the learning needs and opportunities because, again, it's rather more bureaucratic than the last section. But if we get those things right at an early stage, it makes life easier for everybody. So, just to reiterate, the initial mentoring agreement is aligned to the PCF level, readiness for direct practice. Now, mostly that's a level of competence that the majority of the apprentices have already achieved. I think it's a good idea. Go and make yourself familiar with it a little bit. If you get the PCF right, as I've said before, the apprenticeship standards will kind of follow along, even though there's some work to be done about aligning those standards for us at Kingston and indeed nationally. So they have considerable knowledge and skills, but what they're starting to do now is to think like a social worker, which is not quite the same as what they have been doing beforehand. The RDP level covers the whole year. So they are employees on that 80-20, 4 days, 1 day split, but that lasts the whole year. So even in August, for example, there are activities, self-guided study, and so on that we ask them to do. So term times, things like that, yeah, to an extent, but this is a different learning arrangement than some of the more traditional ways of doing things. Um, they will be submitting a portfolio in June 20. Oh, I said 23 there. It's actually June 24th. Do you know what? I'm not going to go back and change it now. I've started, so I'll begin. So maybe you'll take a little comfort in the fact that I also do very stupid things and make mistakes. I don't set up the mistakes to learn, but we know that people do learn from mistakes. And maybe I'll learn to check my slides more thoroughly before I continue. Um, so this will contain obviously different elements. So the mentoring agreement is one of the more powerful elements and one of the things that takes more time. But there are other things like direct observations and so on that are part of that portfolio. You become more familiar with those, and there will be some recorded sessions about expectations for those other elements at a later stage. But at the start of the program, this is the first thing, or one of the first things we have to get right. So these are the basic sections, contact details, roles, blah, 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 blah. I'm sure you can read the slide. And we've already dealt with the working relationship. We keep on working at that, and that's not, an event. It's a process, as we often say. We keep on identifying the apprentice's strengths, and perhaps as we progress, we begin to kind of work out where the apprentice needs to put a little bit more effort, what kind of areas for development they are. So on to roles and responsibilities, which is quite extensive, and they are laid out in the document in great detail. They're also laid out in the on-the-job learning handbook, and rather than go through that line by line, which would be amazingly tedious, I'd kind of invite you to go and have a little look at that and familiarize yourself with it. I don't think any of it will be too surprising, but nonetheless, it's a good idea to have some sort of an idea what's going on there. So obviously apprentice, mentor, line manager, sub-regional assessor, and in the last year in particular, the learning and development lead in the employing organization all have a part to play. Quite detailed. You could hold on to those questions until the end of the session, by which I mean email me, ring me up. I'm happy to do a Zoom if you are in any way confused or kind of puzzled by any of the elements in those roles and responsibilities. So as you can see, we've done all of that lot, and now we're down to these: learning needs, learning opportunities, action plan, good kind of idea, and signatures. Things need to be signed. There's a contractual nature to these documents, as you're kind of well aware, I guess. And I have mentioned that in previous sessions. Signature kind of indicates that everybody agrees with what's been written. So they'll have some good ideas about their learning needs, because they'll be looking at social work roles and social workers probably on their same teams, but not always. And they'll be quite conscious perhaps of the things that they can and cannot do, or are allowed to do and not allowed to do, because obviously there's some tasks that are only the responsibility of social workers. After all, 'tis protected title, registration and all that kind of thing, and some additional responsibilities come with that. So you'll try to be comprehensive about your learning needs. So having an initial discussion about what they can and can't do, what they do know how to do, etc., that's probably not a bad start. Try to kind of think about what's the difference between a qualified and an unqualified social work person, as it were. So work-related issues are very important. Now, sometimes people think this work-related issues, there's a little bit of confusion. Perhaps we could call it something else. But the kind of thing is, so first of all, you think, is their current role offering enough social work opportunities? Because we do find, particularly at level 4, that sometimes workers are in teams where there is little or no interaction with other people. There might be a brokerage role, for example, or more administrative functions and things of that nature. Quite often there's a quick shift out of one of those kind of teams into something that has more got to do with, like, say, I don't know, family support or something of that nature. Personal advisor comes to mind. So there may have to be a shift early on into a team where there is more opportunities. Doesn't always happen, but we're considering plan it and do it sooner rather than later. Are there other factors to be considered? And again, when we were talking about those work-related issues, some of those might be quite personal. So are there significant care responsibilities that the apprentice has? Do they have to look after younger people, children, older people, kind of dependents, etc.? Are there kind of issues to consider about that? And do we have to make some sort of reasonable adjustments for those? Are there specific learning needs or difficulties? For example, does the person have dyslexia? Chances are, if they do, they've already got a series of strategies for managing work, paperwork, and the bureaucracy already. So what strengths can they bring to enable them to deal with these new sets of challenges? So there may be many other things to be considered, including accessibility of buildings, perhaps, their experiences of discrimination in the workplace. There could be many and various things, but we need to have a conversation about those, because if there are obstacles or barriers to learning, we need to kind of think, well, how are we going to plan to ensure that these things do not get in the way? So have that kind of conversation early on. And then we're thinking about the specific learning needs about social work practice. And you need to, again, kind of work out what those things are. Now, a little note of caution, remember it's at the level of RDP, so we're not looking for tasks that kind of require qualified social worker. Jacqueline Harry, one of our colleagues on the program, says we're not looking for tap dancing on the moon. So be kind of modest and realistic about what can be achieved, because if your, how would I say, aspirations are too far ahead and more suitable for levels 2 and 3, you just kind of put the apprentice in the panic zone. Do you know what I mean? Where they're kind of overfaced with responsibilities and maybe they're not quite ready for yet. So let's think about progress on a learning arc over time rather than, oh, quickly get et cetera, don't help. Do you know what I mean? That was my attempt at panic, but you know, there you go. The SRA should oversee the agreement, and they might point out to you kind of things where there could be a little bit more, a little bit less. So, for example, the thing that I often find when people do these initially is they don't put supervision as a learning opportunity. Now, it's a kind of almost a cliche in social work education that social workers get more reflective supervision in their training than they do later on in their career. I'm not sure that's entirely true, but it might be true for a lot of people. But it's a really important learning experience. It's that opportunity to sit down and talk with a more experienced and skilled professional who's been doing the job sometimes for many years and has not only the professional knowledge and wisdom, but what we call phronesis, which is the kind of personal level of skill and kind of wisdom, practice wisdom, sometimes we call it. Do you know what I mean? That's invaluable. That's huge. So make sure you put that in there. Do you know why wouldn't you? But quite often people forget. I kind of think they underestimate perhaps the importance of it. You will be reviewing the agreement. Obviously, you should be doing it about now, which will be September, October. And then you'll be thinking about the review December, January, that kind of time. Now, we give approximations of when things should happen. Try to stick to the timetable if you can, but we recognize it's the real world, and there are going to be um, times when you don't exactly meet the deadlines. There needs to be a little bit of flexibility here, and we're okay with that. For the final submission, submitting your portfolio in June, no, there is no flexibility really. It has to be handed in on the day. Well, actually, to be honest, there is a little bit of flexibility, but don't spread it around too much. Anyway, so when we're thinking of learning opportunities, let's just think about it in general, first of all. And perhaps you could even cast your own mind back to when you were training as a social worker. And the kind of typical sort of process that we see is that we go from observing or shadowing, that we do things with support, sometimes with quite a bit of support, and then we're aiming for autonomous or independent practice as we go. Now, this kind of process is very typical throughout the program, but at this stage of affairs, it's probably weighted to the left-hand side, whereas later on, we're expecting more to the right-hand side, by which I quite simply mean you might do more shadowing and more doing with support in this year, but by the time we come to the end of the program, it'll be less shadowing, probably much more targeted shadowing on specific activities, um, less support, and a lot more autonomy. I mean, the support never goes away and there's always oversight of the work, but that kind of arc shifts, you know, it kind of moves from one to the other. So, how might we actually write learning opportunities in a meaningful way? Because, quite simply, it's not enough really just to kind of list things that happen, because that tells us the type of learning opportunity. It doesn't tell us what is actually being learned. It's an important distinction. But if you're generating these things, I mean, there are lots of different ways to go about this, but this is two of the typical things that you see. So on the left-hand side is you start with what happens in your team. What's your own workload like? What's your typical day to day? And of course, you do every day because there are going to be some activities you probably do every day. Every week, things that happen less frequently. Team meetings might be an important example of that because they are also learning opportunities, and things that happen less frequently. In adult services in level 6, people are often looking for opportunities to observe the court of protection. And people tell me that doesn't happen very often, Dermot. I mean, it is kind of important, but it's not as easy to set up as you might think. That's perhaps a more extreme example, but I'm sure you can think of other things that you don't do that frequently, but are a very important part of your role. The other way of doing things is start with the standards. So you could go PCF 1 to 9 and think what opportunities are under each one. Now, there's definite advantages in that. You're almost certainly going to cover all the PCFs that way, aren't you? But there are also some complexities, and well, let's have a look and see what it looks like. Now, I have an extended metaphor in the next few slides. Very poor stylistically, actually, but never mind. I'm going to do it anyway. So you'll see the phones, the little phone pictures kind of appearing in slides. And so I started with very simple examples. What happens every day? Answer the phone. Every week, you might do a home visit. And less frequently, you might present to the team meeting, as distinct from just attending. So they're fairly kind of common things, unthreatening in some ways, unless you have never done them before, in which case they might promote quite a bit of anxiety. So with these standards, I was kind of thinking, PCF 7 might be skills in intervention about answering the phone. Yeah, that doesn't fit too bad. Okay. PCF, home visit. Well, it turns out that a home visit might cover pretty much any of the standards, isn't it? But nonetheless, you could still start that way. That might actually suit people better. And for some people, particularly if they're educators and they're experienced at that, that kind of model might suit better. So they're simple examples. Of course, the PCF is intended not to be a kind of 1, 2, here. It's intended to be a holistic assessment. And as the social worker apprentice or learner develops over time, it starts to be very obvious that any given activity might meet many PCFs. The context of tasks is important, but again, it's all about holistic opportunities. And really, we need to have perhaps a little bit of a recognition that for a lot of the apprentices, a lot of their jobs are quite routinized, task driven. Go and do the assessment, do this thing, do that thing, tick the box, come back and tell me they have done it and do it before the end of the week, kind of a thing. Well, I'm sure social workers would probably say to me, well, we have to do that too, Dermot, but not quite in the same way. And social work brings a level of criticality and reflectiveness to decision making that is quite often not required of the unqualified people in our places of employment. But in any event, just having the task or opportunities, as I said before, that goes some way, but it's not really telling us what did you learn. Do you know what I mean? It's just go and do a thing. Not quite the same things, are they? So let's take the example, just again, extended metaphor, very poor really, but let's think about answering the phone. Now, it's kind of might seem kind of stupid, but again, it casts your mind back, or maybe you think about when you had to do this for the first time in a professional capacity, and perhaps you've seen other students in particular do this. So it's not uncommon. I've seen this many times. I'm sure you have too, maybe not, but take my word for it. It's not uncommon to see people really, you kind of, can you ring up X? And they go, okay, what am I supposed to say to them? Well, just say to them, we have to do Y or whatever. And they go, what happens if they tell me to Anglo-Saxon, or if they kind of hang up, or if they get really upset? And they start to kind of, I don't like the phrase overthinking, but trying to think of all the various possibilities that might happen. They make notes, make sure I tell them this or that. Now, that might sound like overstatement, but I have seen it enough from learners to know that this is not an entirely common experience. When you pick up the phone and ring somebody, just go, all right, okay. And away you go, because you're just so used to it, so skilled at it, and then you've kind of assimilated and internalized those skills to the extent you don't have to think about it too much. So you've internalized the learning. The learners are still in the process of doing that. So we'll not get into kind of phrases like, why can't they just ring up the person and do their conversation? Because they're not you and they may not have learned how to do that yet. But they can, of course. So answering the phone and the skill of doing that is not quite the same as teaching somebody to answer the phone. Because when you think about all the internalized learning that goes into answering the phone, there's actually quite a lot of stuff that you know. I mean, you know about phones for a start. I mean, that might sound stupid, but if you didn't know about phones, you'd have to learn that. So you've learned that so long ago, you don't even think about it. How does the student approach phones? What do they know about phones? So start by defining your terms and kind of working out where the student is. And that's that conversation about learning needs, working out what they don't know, what they can't do. Do you know what I mean? There might be a little bit of kind of tension in that discussion, of course, because people aren't always all that willing to say what they don't know. One of the best learning strategies in any context is to kind of admit, or admit. You see, even the word to talk, perhaps, about what you don't know. Because a lot of the time we have to kind of present ourselves in such a way, of course, I know how to do that, you know. Maybe that's a man thing, but I suspect it's not entirely a man thing. In any event, uh, you have a script. And scripts is kind of a term that we borrow from psychology. It's automatic ways of doing things. We don't have to go through the tick box of the clipboard of every element of what we know because it's sufficiently an internalized script that we don't have to kind of rehearse it every time that we use it. So maybe then kind of bear that in mind when you're thinking about new skills and knowledge that the apprentices needs to learn. Remember, they are a learner and that you can be a teacher. So I have to write about these things. Because in the agreement, there's a section, learning opportunities. There's quite a few of them. Now, I expect to see quite a few learning opportunities. If I'm seeing 5 or 6, I'm thinking that's not really doing it here. Do you know what I mean? Because there are definitely a lot more learning opportunities. I avoid bunching them up together, trying to make them distinct and discrete. It's much easier to track. It's much easier to kind of identify elements of each of these competences if you separate them out. Anyway, does that make sense? I'm not sure I explained that as well as I should do. But in any event, it's not just the opportunity, answering the phone, making a phone call or whatever. It's what they should learn or hope to learn from that opportunity. Now, the distinction here is kind of obvious in one way, but we know that in social work, you set up a learning opportunity and you think this is what the learning is going to be, but social work is a bit weird, isn't it? You know, anything can happen at times. So the learning actually might be something different from the intended learning outcome. So we just kind of have to bear that in mind. So there's a couple of things also to think about when we're writing learning opportunities, and that's about process and timing. So we have that kind of process already. Go back to the PCF. There's actually levels of learning at each PCF level. You know, they are distinguished by complexity, I suppose, essentially, and how sophisticated they are. So it's things that happen over time. Do you know what I mean? Give people time. Don't expect them to get everything in the first go because they won't always. And of course, for some elements of their practice, they may be streets ahead. They may already be expert. And other things, they're kind of really struggling with. So it's not that you're a novice or an expert in total. You will be kind of having layers and all the points in between, of course, of these things as the process goes ahead. So just kind of, this is Vygotsky's zone of proximal development, very old. You see it in lots of learning kind of contexts, but we often see it kind of bowdlerize or reduce the more simplistic elements of comfort learning and panic zones. So in the comfort zone, there's little challenge, might be a lot of support perhaps, but not very much happening in the way of growth and development there, really. It's just kind of like, it's like a nice warm bath, which is not a bad thing, but it's not really going to progress us all that far. In the panic zone, of course, there's far too much going on. If you overburden or give the apprentice tasks that are beyond their present competence too much, then nothing is happening, is it? They just go into blind panic. They kind of go, I can't do this. It's de-skilling, demotivating, really not a good idea, which is one of the reasons it's very important to negotiate these things, that we're making kind of reasonable steps, because the learning zone is pushing out of the comfort zone, as they say, cliche, but nonetheless true, but not into the panic zone. So enough development to push things forward, but not enough to freak the person out. So we'll go back to the writing learning outcomes. So we think then about the kind of words or phrases that might be associated with those kind of proximal scaffolding, slight steps forward that we need to make. Now, know what a phone is. Well, okay, we probably know what a phone is. Understand about how to use a phone. That's actually a little bit more complicated than we might think. Be able to apply your knowledge to phones in real situations. Okay, so at level 4, definitely we're going to be doing all of those things. Analyze your use of phones. So after that phone call that the student or the learner or the apprentice was terrified by, we might sit down and have a little reflective discussion. How do you think that went? Was there any bits of it that you could have maybe done better? Were there things that you thought that actually that really went quite well? Were there any surprises, et cetera, et cetera? So we can have some, you could use SWOT analysis or whatever suits you to do that. But to critically analyze phones and social work is a different thing, isn't it? What's the experience of a person with lived experience when they ring up and they're faced with a phone menu that, first of all, they might not be able to access for various different reasons, and then they might not be able to understand because maybe the phone menu was set up on a kind of, for the MASH team, please ring, for the first point of contact team, for the blah blah team, and the person's kind of going, I don't know what any of these things mean. So, are we putting barriers in access to services by having things like phone banking and kind of receptionists and triage and all these kind of things? I would argue, yes, we are indeed. It's kind of neoliberal managerial construct that is kind of invaded social work and most aspects of public life, and not always to the good. Now, we could have a critical discussion about that at another time, but we're not doing so today. But you know what I mean? We're talking about critically analyzing is a very different thing from understanding it or doing it yourself. And of course, we get into creativity, suggesting new ways in which phones could be used. Maybe we'll just abandon phones and we only actually ever talk to people like this, for example, or perhaps only face to face. How radical is that? That's not going to be happening anytime soon, but you get the general idea. So there's layers, and levels of learning, and you might progress up these levels. This aligns almost perfectly with Bloom's taxonomy of learning. Now, this is as old as the hills, and it underpins teaching and learning across all disciplines that you can possibly think of, even though you might not even have heard of this. So it's got that notion of there's different layers, levels, sophistication in knowledge and learning. Now that's a kind of fairly old. It looks like what it used to look like when it started off, but this is a bit more where we are now. So typically, people would say that the left-hand arrow is from lots to hots, and that is low-order thinking skills to higher-order thinking skills. And at either extreme end of the pyramid, at the bottom you have remembering. So that might be rote learning. So when I was in school, you did your times tables. So I can tell you exactly what 6 times 7 is because it has been drummed into me, sometimes in ways that we wouldn't really kind of advise doing in the modern era. At the top, creating. What is creative thinking? No, not something that just kind of a small little sliver of society is able to do. It's something that anybody is able to do. So, how we frame these things also makes a big difference. But as you can see, on the right-hand side, there are verbs that are associated with these different levels of learning. So when you're writing these learning opportunities and you're thinking about what the intended learning outcomes are, I would advise you to have a little look at the verbs. The remembering, comprehending, and applying stuff, there'd be a greater emphasis on those things in the first year. And as we progress through the course, analyzing, evaluating, and creating become more important. Now, this is not to say that the apprentices are not doing those kind of higher order things at this stage of the course, because some of them most certainly are. But it's about our expectations and the levels of learning that we're kind of asking the apprentice to engage in at this stage. They may exceed that, great. But we're thinking about a whole group of learners moving as one. So we have a general set of expectations at the start that are more down, well, probably up to certainly analyzing, I suppose, really. So maybe that you should be writing your learning outcomes with this kind of idea in mind. So you can kind of think again, what do I want the student or the learner to know? Well, obviously, the know what a phone is, remembering, understand how to use a phone, fine, we got that. Apply their knowledge. They're getting better. They might need more opportunities to do that. Practice makes perfect, repetition is good, and so on. And then they might analyze or reflect. Now, if they were getting that far at this stage with all those learning opportunities that you're identifying, I'd be going, yeah, good, that's what we're looking for this year. If they can critically analyze these things, and they will be, maybe more commonly in some areas that they're comfortable with than others, that would be great. And I would hope to see that. But I'm expecting to see more of 4, 5, and 6 in the coming years than I am this year. I hope that's kind of clear. Maybe some use to you. This apprentices, I nearly call them students, habitual sort of terminology. Um, the apprentices will have access to exemplars. So one of the really helpful things when we're doing experiential learning, learning by doing, is to see how other people did it. So you might ask your student, apprentice, learner, um, oh, do you have exemplars? Could I have a look at one of the exemplars? Um, that might kind of help to kind of reframe, because when you see the actual physical example, it becomes much easier to understand than the kind of theoretical construct, which is essentially what I've talked about today. And of course, the SRA is there to help you out with all of these things and should be able to give you a little bit of feedback to see if you're in the right direction. So that's phones. Oh dear. This is not the phone here so much anymore, is it? I mean, it is a key tool, but it has a lot more to it than just the ability to text and call people. And we are in the age of IT, are we not? For all its wonderfulness and drawbacks. I hope that's been kind of some help when you're thinking about um, learning opportunities. So try to remember it as a process rather than an event, that there is development over time, and that time is 3 years. The apprentice is an apprentice for the whole of the year. So they might be involved in all sorts of activities for, I suppose, roughly about 10 and a half months by the time you take leave and everything into account. Every interaction indeed with staff and people with lived experience is a learning opportunity. But you're asked here to kind of identify the ones that you are planning and will make sure will happen. Um, Review those things. We reflect on the individual learning experience and the experience as a whole. And by kind of step by step, moving consistently into the learning zone, the student, learner, apprentice will be able to put their portfolio together in June 24. I think that's good enough for me. The next session will be about the index of evidence. So that's essentially, you've had all these learning opportunities. How are you going to record them to show that they've actually happened? It's quite a short session, but the index of evidence is something that they will maintain over the whole of the course. And we'll do a little one about APTEM and doing the tripartite meetings, because that's one of the tasks that you have to get used to very early on. So, as ever, get in touch, talk to your SRA, ring me, etc., etc. I think you get the message. Talk to you soon. Bye. Take care.